Hello and welcome to a new podcast called The Dirty Corner. Now, full disclosure, I tried to film episode 1 last night and realised that there were several preparations that I needed to make before starting the first episode. So it was a bit too rambling and not as much happened, and I thought what I need to do is just think for a moment before starting the episode of one of the events I want to discuss. Now, what I did discuss in my test run last night is something that I might cover again, but I need to think more clearly and make notes about what happened and when. So, this is not going to be in chronological order. What happened last night was that I tried to start from the beginning, and that's not necessarily the best way to go about it. To be clear, the Dirty Corner is about stories that I have from going to art school and also working as an artist before and after uni. But for the first bulk of this podcast, it will be focusing on art school because there were lots of instances of unpleasant, unkind, unfair and unprofessional incidents that occurred there that I think should be shared with an audience as a cautionary tale, as entertainment, and as a type of video diary of how I felt experience in art school was from my vantage point. Other people who went there had a different experience, and we'll cover that as well. So, I'm going to start this episode by discussing a bit of background for the school. This school was split into a main campus and then up the road an art building. And because I was on a fine art course, I was in the art building. I was in a crowded studio, mostly young women, a handful of mature students, and I would have been one of the mature students. But the young women students there, several of them said that they saw me as closer to their age than the other mature students because I looked younger than the other mature students and I acted a bit more immature and young still than my age. Not in inappropriate ways, but in ways which differentiated me from the others, the other more mature students, I should say. The point being that it was a crowded studio, and at first I was concerned that there would be some problems with some of the characters there, but it seemed to be okay except for a couple of strange interactions, and then something happened and it all changed. And that's in the studio. But things were wrong outside of just our studio, and that's what I'm going to discuss in this episode. We had certain events happen, and they were planned events where groups of the students would get together and do either performances or readings or demonstrations or interactive events, and that would be this live art making night. It was fun. It was later on, but we stuck around or returned and took part. And what I did, because I like drawing, is I would go around and draw what was happening. And that was something which I really enjoyed, was trying to capture a moment in a drawing is very different than a photograph. And I think has a lot of energy and fun to it, which you lose in, just taking pictures. Things become flattened and can be framed strangely, whereas a drawing tries to capture the movement and the excitement, and that's what I was trying to do. And then, these events would be somewhat unusual events. One I remember being, there would be a circle of people watching, and inside the circle you would have two people holding a stick, one at either end of this fairly long stick, and they would hold it like that so that the stick went out that way, and this was the end of the stick. And they'd be walking around. It was almost like a dance. quite entertaining and fun. That was one which I drew. And there was another where in a room a young student was talking about applying makeup to your face so that CCTV cameras couldn't detect your face because the makeup would obscure the facial features and would confuse the kind of facial recognition software. So that was fun. Good idea. I did a drawing at that one as well, a couple of drawings. There were lots of occasions where I really enjoyed what was happening and I thought it was a great event, as in the whole night was a great event, and each of these specific rooms would be really interesting. I didn't get to see all of them, but most of the time it was things which I thought were creative and fun and just kind of well thought out and an interesting way of approaching aspects of life from an artistic point of view, whether it was dancing with the stick and to show the beauty of this turn, like an old-fashioned dance, but using the stick. And this is just from a completely superficial observation of what was happening. I didn't get any explanation for any deeper meaning behind it, but that's what it looked like on the surface, was mimicking an old-fashioned dance and maybe even replicating it using the stick in between. Maybe that was part of an old-fashioned ritual, I'm not sure. But that was nice and fun to see. And then the facial recognition one is a great way of trying to have that rebellious streak against the over surveillance state that we're in as a country. Talking about the UK, I'm sure most countries are the same. Anyway, the event happened, and this was the first one that I'd been to, because there were several of these throughout the time that I was at art school. And the event happens, and the next day I have the drawings in a folder, and I'm talking to the people who I saw there and saying how much I enjoyed what they did and how good it was. And there were some students who were in the university who'd already graduated. They were returning students. And there was one of these people, one of the returning students, who said, can I have your drawings to scan and use, and I'll give you them back? I said, yeah, of course. And I said, where I'll give them to you, in the room, because I didn't have them on me at that time. They said, yeah, just come and bring them to me when you can. That's my memory of it. Either I handed them to them there, or I went to their room later and put them on their desk when they were there. Because I was a bit protective. I wouldn't just leave them there when no one's around and walk away unless it looked incredibly tidy. So I either handed them over to them at that point or returned when they were at their desk and gave them these drawings. It was about 4 or 5 pages of drawings. They were scribbly drawings, but I think those can be some of the most interesting sketches that you can make. And because they're documenting an event, a moment in time where you can't replicate that again, it's just that moment you've captured. That's why I cared about it. I leave them with the students and then go back to doing whatever you do in uni, the different workshops or whatever we were doing. And I think it was later in the day, or maybe the next day, that I said, did you use the drawings? Can I get them back? And I think the first time I asked, they said, I haven't used them yet. So I said, that's fine, I'll get them off you tomorrow. And the next day, this is from memory, so this could be inaccurate, but the next day I'd been and asked them where it was. I think I'd seen them in the corridor. Oh no, I'd been to their desk, and another student said, oh, they're not here at the moment. They're, I don't know, they're in such a room, so-and-so's room. So I'd been to this other room, seen them and said, I was just wondering if I could get the drawings back to put in the folder if you've used them. And they said, yeah, I've put them in your room, in your studio. I was like, all right, great, thanks for that. And I go back to the studio and I look at my desk and the drawings aren't there. And then I think maybe they went to the wrong desk. So I start looking at other people's desks, thinking, surely they've just placed them down on a desk, thinking so long as they're in the studio, they'll make their way back to the person who drew them. But I didn't see them on anyone's desk. And there wasn't anyone else in the studio at the time. A lot of the time, our studio would be empty. I mean, it'd be full of people's things, but no one else would be in there. And my memory is of walking around everyone's desk and no one being there. And then at some point, realizing that one of the drawings I noticed was on the floor. And I picked it up and thought, oh, is it on this desk here? And it wasn't. And I looked further over and there was another one on the floor and another one, and it was all around the room. Because the room was so full and busy of things and a mess, it wasn't easy to see that until I actually noticed them on the floor. And all of them were on the floor and they'd all been stepped on by a big muddy boot, which I was a bit concerned about. And I think I went back to the student and said to this person, they were just scattered on the floor and stepped on. And they just kind of shrugged and went, well, I just put them in your studio. And I remember thinking, this is a bit disrespectful to what I've given them to use. I wouldn't do this to someone. I would be quite careful and protective over their work. And even though they're just scribbled sketches, I just don't think you should do that with other people's work. It just felt weird. But they didn't care, and I was a bit put off by it. And I realised that this person was only a small person. They didn't have big boot, to step on this. This was someone from my studio who'd stepped on them. So I don't have the full story of what happened. They either put them in the studio and then someone came along and stepped on them, or they'd gone in the studio with this and met this person and decided to scatter them on the floor and step on them, or they'd put them in the studio, a gust of wind had come from somewhere, they'd blown on the floor and someone innocently stepped on them and not realised they were there. Let's say, for the most charitable interpretation, that's what happened. Some gust of wind had just blown just my drawings on the floor, scattered them around the room, and someone had come along and just happened to have circled around and stepped on the drawings, not realising. I think that's unlikely, but let's say that's what happened. I still think that the person, this returning student, someone who's already graduated, should surely have more care and consideration for someone's work than to do that, than to allow that to happen. For example, if I were to say to a student, in the event last night you wrapped up a piece of string on a stick, do you mind if I put that into the scanner and scan off a print of it for a document I want to make about the event? And they said yes. I would hold the string on the stick to make sure it didn't slide down and move or whatever. And they may say, oh, I don't really care. But until they actually say it doesn't matter to me, I would preserve it. And even if they said I don't care, I'd want it to look the way that I received it from them, because that's what you're trying to capture, is that moment, that energy of the string being wrapped around a stick. There was no string around a stick. I'm just saying as an example, if that were to happen and I were in the other position, I would be careful. I'd make sure that that didn't come to any harm and was returned to them in as close a condition as I received it as possible. And that's not what happened with my drawings. Now, you may think big deal, but this is just a small start of things which went downhill fast at the school. Really fast. And an indicator for me was that there were third year students. I was in my first year at this point. Third year students who were in a room, and they would share this space with these returning students, who'd only be about 2 or 3 of them, who'd come in and have this air of ownership about them. they've graduated, they came back in, they were very comfortable, but they weren't welcoming and embracing new students. They would just kind of waltz around, similar to one of the tutors actually. And they would share the space with third year students. Now in the third year room, there were several artists in there, and when I walked in, you would see artists kind of look like that and go back to their work, and I wouldn't want to go and bother them. And there was one person whose desk faced outward into the room, and she would look up. She was a mature student, very friendly, and I went up and spoke to her. Not only was she friendly and approachable, but she did figurative painting. So I thought, great connection. Talked to her, and we got along really well. And there was a time when I saw her, because I used to arrive first thing in the morning before anyone else, and I saw her in the morning once show up, and I'd carried all my things back and forth into the studio because it'd be too much to carry in one trip, plus you have to swipe in with a card. So I would normally take in a portfolio folder and my drink, and then I'd come back down and get my bag and my easel, and I'd come back down and I'd get something else, and just doing as much as possible to get things into the building. I had plenty of time, and then I ran into this mature student, and she was getting something out of her boot, and I offered if I could help, and she said, yeah, but it's eggs, so be careful with it. And I said, no, of course, I'll make sure they don't get broken. And she said, I know, I trust you. She said, if there's ever a point where I need my work moving from one place to another, it would be you who I'd ask. I said, really? And she said, yeah, I can tell that you respect other people's work and would be careful. And she'd only talked to me twice, I think, and it said a lot about her experience with other artists. Now, she wasn't someone who was trying to correct any of the mishaps that would occur. She's someone who was trying to keep her head down and just get through the course and not judge other people for how they behaved. I can't do that. I feel as though people's behaviour affects me and affects others, and should be encouraged to behave in a more considerate way without being told off or demeaned or anything which is inappropriate. So that's what I tried to do, was to try and encourage better behaviour. This already sounds as though I'm going around going, you should really do this. I wasn't doing that. I would just instead say, I was a bit surprised to see my drawings on the floor and they had footprints on them, to try and express that that was something which I didn't like. And the returning student, who wasn't a mature student, well, wasn't that old, just shrugged their shoulders and said, I don't know, I just put them in your studio. Didn't say on your desk, they just said in your studio. So they just didn't care, even though I was trying to sort of say, this is how I felt when I found my drawings. And I think that is a general feel for how things can fall apart quite quickly. Because if people don't respect others' work, then all of a sudden it can become malicious. And how do you differentiate malice from just, unconscious disregard or lack of consideration, which I couldn't tell with mine. Maybe it was someone who was ignorant of the fact that handling someone else's work should be something with care. Doesn't matter if it's on really rubbish paper or bits of literal, rubbish from the bin. If that's their artwork and they've presented it as their artwork, surely it should be considered with a bit more care than to just treat it as though it's rubbish. It was a strange adjustment for me. I think that I tried to embrace this. It doesn't matter, it's not worth anything. But even in that case, I don't like that someone didn't care about the effect it had. And it may, as I said, sound petty, but it was an indicator for how things would all of a sudden shift. Now that was a few drawings from an event, but that's a taste of why this is called the Dirty Corner, and it all leads to the Dirty Corner, which is, there's a reason why it's called, this podcast is called that. But I would say vandalism of other people's artwork continued with mine and others that I will discuss in another episode. But that may have not been vandalism, it may have just been careless disregard, and as a byproduct it got stepped on and it looked as though it had been purposely what would you say, not damaged, but purposely marked and scuffed and treated poorly. That was my impression, that was my takeaway from it, but also the response from the returning student. When I talked to fellow students about it, there were only a couple of people who said, that's not right, you shouldn't do that. Most of the students, not most of them, I didn't speak to most students, but other students who I would mention this to would say, oh, I don't know, and just shrug their shoulders and not want anything to do with it. I kind of understand that, but that's part of the problem. I think people who don't care enough about what happens to others can help things go the wrong way. And this wasn't something which I was campaigning for, saying this is an injustice I've been victim of. It was just something where I said, I can't believe this happened. They were just on the floor, got stood on. They're only, kind of sketchy drawings, but it's a bit of a worry for me that that's going to happen. I think I'm going to be a bit more protective over my work, because I don't know if I can trust that other people will handle it with care now. And as I said, there was a couple of people who said, yeah, that seems weird that it would be stood on and so many would have boot marks on them. I think I tried to clean them with a dry cloth, and I still have some, which I can try to show you, because I do have them up there. Okay, let's see. This is one of the drawings. So there's a group of the students, and as far as I can tell, you can't see a footprint on here. There's a bit of something on there. I don't know what it is, but there's a bit of kind of yellow on there. I don't know if you can see it. I think it's around here. I don't know. That's something, but who knows what it is. And then this top one here, that was a drawing of one of the students there. So that was the type of drawing I'd be doing. Trying to get, remember the stick that I told you about? This is how I couldn't really draw the stick. It's too hard to draw it. So instead what I had was loose outlines of the people holding the stick and how they held it. So they held it above their head apparently, which I didn't remember. I thought it was out like that, and so it's kind of, it was above their head. That's why you do these sketches, is to try and capture the movement, the direction. I even have an arrow for it, but anyway. Drawings of the tutor, one of the tutors. But yeah, this is one which has some marks on it. Now I did take some of them off. This is the one which I said was the makeup workshop. So I've got one drawing of someone having makeup applied and another drawing of one of the students. And you'll be able to see that there are some marks across here. Now it's very subtle, but this was clean pieces of paper when I drew it, and they were all scuffed and had boot prints on them, and I wiped them off as best as I could. It's another part of workshops with a chap here. There's a little bit of something here. Just bits of sketchy drawings, but it just made a difference to me to try to capture what I was seeing. And it's a shame when they become damaged, because that's it, ruined then. So that's what I was trying to describe, is those types of drawings, whereas other drawings that are sketchy that I did, not from the event, won't have any marks or boot prints or scuffs on them, because I try to preserve the paper. Any marks that occur should happen at the point of the drawing. It shouldn't happen by neglect, or I don't know, you know, it just shouldn't happen to someone else's work. And if it does happen, it's not the end of the world. I just say, oh, sorry, I think I just put them on a random desk. I don't know whose it was, or yeah, I'm not sure what happened. Sorry about that, but they weren't on the floor when I left, or whatever, you know, I'd say something, but I certainly wouldn't go, I don't know, I just put them in your studio. It just showed a lack of care and concern. As I said, this may seem minor and petty, but that set the tone for what was to turn into, you know, not to me necessarily, but to several people, including me, which is psychological and emotional abuse, vandalism, theft, physical assault, as in someone being shoved, you know, like a violent kind of physical assault, sexual assault, targeting by tutors, being left out of opportunities that would be given to specific people and not others, and being kind of excluded from conversations and opportunities generally, and just lots of coercive behaviour from tutors and students, and intimidation generally. So what I'm talking about here is more neglect and disregard, but that's the start of what turned out to be bad experiences at what I consider to be the worst art school in the world. There's possibly worse, but what I experienced there was such a domino effect of one thing after the other, that this was a mild beginning to what ramps up into something that was very unpleasant and very targeted and purposeful, which is why when you look back at things like this, it wasn't insignificant and nothing. It was basically a point of view, or an approach which the whole school seemed to embody, and certain students didn't. But a lot of the students would keep their head down and try to keep out of things. Some students would stick their head up and say, is this right? This doesn't seem right. And other students and faculty would try to crush that dissent. Sounds dramatic, sounds crazy, but I guarantee you, if you continue watching The Dirty Corner, I will discuss all of this and more. But this has been episode 1, where I discuss my first experience of my work being disregarded and somewhat damaged by a returning student who, in my opinion, should have known better. So look forward to the next episode, where I will discuss another story, and each one will either increase in severity or intensity, or expand upon the world which I'm trying to build for you, to have an understanding of what I feel as though was happening there and I experienced personally as a student at on this fine art course at this school. Now, as a side note, I would encourage people to not go to art school generally, and I was encouraged not to, and I still went. So if you're going to disregard that, I completely understand and support you in your interest in trying to have an art education. But I found the education, the environment, and the students and faculty to be all unpleasant and actually a detriment to my art making. You may get lucky and not have that, but I've heard stories from Scotland down to London that it is bad, and it's not just in the art school sector. So alright, I'll see you next time.